Peter Hitchens, last time we spoke you said that one of the worst things about modern politics was that people don't treat their opponents as human beings and they don't give them all due respect. But 2 days later you wrote an article in which you constantly referred to David Cameron as Mr. Slippery. And is that treating him with the respect you speak of?
I think that it's there's a different subject under discussion here, and I don't see David Cameron as being in any way unhuman. And in many cases, people have told me, for instance, you hate David Cameron, and I say, well, no, it's perfect. I've met him. He's a perfectly pleasant human being. I have nothing against him. But I think to describe a prime minister as slippery or as Mr. Slippery is in the fine old tradition of English political discourse. And if I ever obtained an office of power, I would expect to be called names. I am called names already. It doesn't trouble me. That's not the essence of what I'm complaining about. The essence of what I'm complaining about is the view which many on the left take, which is that those who do not hold their political opinions simply aren't fully human, are morally bad for holding different opinions.
Is there a line then that you would draw?
Well, all lines are subtle.
Right.
But if I started referring to David Cameron in terms which effectively incited violence against him, or for instance, which evinced contempt for his private life or anything of that kind, then I think that I would be straying across that line. But he is slippery.
Have you ever strayed across?
I'm sure I have. Yes. I'm not some kind of sinless freak. I do bad things. We all do, and I'm sure I've done them. And I'm not. If you reach into my past and into the archives of what I've written, I'm sure you can find examples of it. But I would, if they were drawn to my attention, if they were of the kind which the left often apply to me, then I would apologise for them and repudiate them.
In late spring as well, when we spoke, you said that the Conservative Party couldn't win another election. They were sort of absolutely going downhill. But in some latest opinion polls, they seem to be neck and neck with Labour.
This is the same thing happened during the last Parliament. People don't read opinion polls with any care. If you do, what you will see is, apart from anything else, that they show that Labour will win a majority. But what they also show, and this is, you have to go to the polling company's own websites where they display the actual research rather than the spin which the newspaper has placed upon them. And what you will find is there's still a very, very large number of people who are not inclined to vote at all. That the figures that you're dealing with are rather low. But the Conservative Party, I forget that the last figure I saw was said to be on something like, I think, 28% of the vote, whereas UKIP was on 18%. Now, UKIP is a non-party, it's a joke. And the Conservative and Unionist Party is one of the richest, longest established parties in the country. To be only 10 points ahead of UKIP, and given that this isn't 28% of all people voting, it's 28% of the roughly 62 or 63% of the population who are prepared to vote at all. So in fact, the Conservative Party has the support probably of something like 22% of the population. You don't win an election on that. And if the polls are regionalised, then you'd see that north of the River Trent, the Conservative Party barely exists.
So we can completely disregard the opinion polls, all opinion polls?
You don't disregard them, just read the raw data. Remember that opinion polls are a device for influencing opinion, not a device for measuring it.
Right.
That the questions which are asked are usually intended to produce a certain type of answer. So if you want to, for instance, set a story running that Ed Miliband is a useless leader of the Labour Party, then you commission a poll asking people, is Ed Miliband useless? And no doubt 22% will, or more will say he is. And you can then produce a headline saying 22% say Ed Miliband useless. But you've created that out of thin air with the opinion poll. If the opinion poll hadn't been taken, it wouldn't exist. But if you read the detailed work that the opinion polls, who are respectable, serious social scientists, produce and put on their websites rather than a newspaper interpretation, you'll see a different story, and that is that the Conservative Party is still bumping along the bottom of the political ocean.
And have no chance?
Well, I don't see why they should. I still think that in large parts of the country, most people would rather tandoori their grandmothers and eat them than vote Conservative, and that's not changed.
Yeah. Given the style of your Mail online blog, you make a lot of your political viewpoints publicly available for the whole world to see.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any opinions that you choose not to make public?
I don't think so. I mean, I suppose there must be. I mean, if I were asked my opinion on the political situation in Tuvalu, I would probably say I don't have one, because I don't really know anything about it.
So everything you care about and would say that you know about, you
Yeah,
make
there's
those available?
some things I don't labour anymore. I will sometimes say things simply because I only raise the subject of the death penalty, for instance, because the arguments against it are an insult to the intelligence. And the same goes for the arguments for so-called gun control. The arguments for that are, again, so stupid that someone has to stand up and say, this is drivel. I don't want to own a gun, and I don't actually believe that the death penalty could realistically be restored. But I make these points simply because I think somebody has sometimes to say, this is so monstrously ill-informed and illogical that it's the duty of the intelligent person to point that out.
In John's Gospel, then, on that point, what do you say to the specific instance where Jesus says only those who haven't sinned can cast stones at this criminal, but he, the only sinless person present, chooses not to kill her? And that's Jesus' way of saying, isn't it, that execution is wrong?
No, it's a specific occasion. It's to do with adultery, not with murder. It is particularly directly aimed. What he's saying is, if any of you haven't committed adultery, then perhaps you can stone this woman to death. Otherwise, not. It's completely different from making a general statement on capital punishment. And arguments from silence are, as I will frequently stress, unreliable. But it seems to me that if our Lord had wanted to say a word or two against capital punishment, he had better opportunity than most people to do so, since he was the subject of a show trial and was himself publicly executed in circumstances which were quite thoroughly recorded. So if he'd wanted to say that in principle the idea of execution was wrong, or if the Gospels had wanted to say it, they could have done so. On the contrary, in one of the Gospels, and I never remember which because I don't claim to be a biblical expert, one of the two crucified thieves on either side says that we are here justly punished. Nobody contradicts that. So no, I don't think so. I think actually the religious position on capital punishment is similar to the religious position on just war. It's fundamentally a weapon which can be used under certain very restricted circumstances in defence of civilization, proportionately.
Okay, but economists have found, for example, that it costs more than keeping people in prison.
Well, I've never put it forward as an economy measure,
No.
but when you say it costs more, they're probably dealing with the largely fraudulent exercise of the death penalty in the United States, where it doesn't really exist. It has a political half-existence, but it isn't actually imposed in any kind of proper, consistent,
Would you say it
lawful
would
manner.
act as more of a deterrent than life in prison?
My own view is that it deters acts of violence which are potentially lethal. It deters the carrying of lethal weapons. It deters very violent behaviour. And one of the pieces of evidence which points towards this is the huge increase in very violent crimes in this country since the abolition of the death penalty. But thanks to our much improved health services, they don't lead to the deaths of the victims. So very large numbers of attempted murders and serious wounding cases. Exponential. If these people had the National Health Service of 1965, they'd all be dead, and we'd have a murder rate much higher than that of the United States. As it is, they survive. But the violence which would have killed them has actually risen greatly. And there's also in my book, A Brief History of Crime, an interesting study of the two periods when the death penalty was suspended in this country, in 1948 and 56. During both those periods, the use of weapons in crime rose. And then it fell again after the periods of suspension. Then when the death penalty was finally abolished, it rose and has continued to rise ever since. You can never be sure about causation, but that seems to me to be persuasive.
Were you ever against capital punishment?
Oh, yes.
And what made you change your mind?
I simply couldn't resist the logic. I could not, when I examined the subject, I could not resist the logic which said that it was, in some cases, justifiable. It was a struggle. I hated myself for thinking it, but in the end, I thought, well, I have no alternative. If I am a thinking, intelligent person, I must concede that this case is overwhelming. Which is why, again, when I hear people offering stupid arguments against it, I have to, simply as a matter of honour, to say, even though it gets me into trouble and makes people hate me, I have to say, no, this is not true.
Would you say that you are, at the moment, you are still able to change your mind? Have you changed your mind on an issue, for example, in the past 5
years? Demonstrably, I can show that I have changed my mind on substantial issues in my life. So,
in recent years, have you? Do you think?
Well, I change my mind all the time when circumstances cause me to do so.
What would you say is the average difference between a Daily Mail reader and a Telegraph reader?
I don't know. I'd never thought about it. No, I mean, obviously there are differences. I mean, there are different kinds of papers, but I don't read a newspaper as other people read newspapers. I'm a journalist by trade. I read newspapers for different reasons and in different ways from what other people do, and I really would be very bad at answering a question of that kind. And I think you'll find that certainly this isn't anything like as much so as it was 40 years ago, but to a great extent the English newspaper spectrum reflects the English class system, which is a very complicated thing.
It is.
I mean, for instance, am lower upper middle class.
I think the BBC did a test that you could take online and fill in lots of details about yourself, and then it tells you your class. Well,
it tells you your class by certain categorizations, but I've always thought that a lot of these categorizations were inaccurate. If you are at all sensitive to class gradations, and somebody brought up in the part of the English class system where I was becomes so, it's much more complicated than that. It's certainly very little to do with income.
Is it subjective?
No, it isn't. There are objective things, but they are quite subtle.
And is it positive that we have, or you think we still have a class system?
It's better than a caste system. It's better than any kind of rigid system through which people can move. I think in some ways it does, if it's accepted, it does help people to deal with each other. And you look at the army, for instance, everybody knows that the army is run by NCOs, who are lower middle class at the highest in the class system. But technically they're under the authority of officers who are upper middle class. I think probably the class system enables both of them to get on better than they otherwise would.
Moving on, you said your belief in God is based on the need for a viable justice system.
Not a viable justice system, no.
Or the need for justice.
No, if you desire justice for others, you have to desire it for yourself. So it's a desire for justice, not a system. Yeah. For justice to be a feature of the universe, to be in the air we breathe, and the stones, and the trees, and the sky. Justice is part of it. Mm. And if you desire, say, justice for yourself, and then you desire it for other people, and vice versa. So,
is there not a danger there then of defining God into existence?
Well, there is, but God in Scripture, God defines Himself very much as justice embodied. Mm. He is the source and indeed the nature of justice. That's how you tell what is just and what is not.
You obviously employ evidence and reason when coming to your conclusions about God. But with a belief in God, how much do you think can be reasoned? And how much do you think we have to rely on faith?
Well, reason can take you to the point where you ask yourself, which sort of universe do you desire? One which is a cosmic car crash in which nothing has any significance beyond its immediate effect, in which we are the product of a series of accidents, or a universe which is designed and therefore has a designer and which is purposeful, and therefore has a purpose which is, at least to some extent, discoverable. And those are the available choices. Which one do you prefer?
Therefore, if I did choose the one where we all have a purpose, therefore God exists.
Well, no. Therefore, you act. You then take it upon yourself to act thereafter as if God did exist and God was just. It doesn't make God exist. There are lots of arguments. There are two kinds of argument. Ones which you can use to persuade yourself,
Yeah.
and ones you can use to persuade other people. Anybody can persuade himself that God exists or that God doesn't exist. The difficulty arises when you try to persuade somebody else who doesn't agree with you.
Is there any point in trying to persuade other people that...
I don't believe so, no. I think the only way in which people come to religion is through the example, the good example of believers, and through experience. I think that shouting at people to believe what you believe is a pretty certain way of making them not do so. But I'll defend myself against attack, is really all I do. My only entry into this argument has been to defend what I believe against an attack which is profoundly intolerant in its nature, and it doesn't say, I agree to share the planet with you. It says, what you say is wrong, your children shouldn't be brought up to believe it, it should be censored, and it's despicable and intellectually unrespectable, and you aren't really allowed to hold it. Well, none of that is true, and none of that is right, and I will fight against people who say that. But I've never tried to go among atheists and say, you must believe what I believe, or deride their beliefs as intellectually ludicrous. There's only one position in religion which facts and logic can take you to, and that is agnosticism, because there simply is not proof of the truth of theism or of the truth of atheism, and so you're left on the top of a watershed. Which way will you walk? And it's up to you, or you can carry on walking along the watershed. But there is no possibility of making somebody by argumentative cleverness change their view. I think there's a Peter de Vries novel. Is it Slouching to Kalamazoo? I can't remember. One of them where the village atheist and the village priest engage in a tremendous argument. And at the end of it, the atheist has become a religious believer, and the priest has become an atheist.
Brilliant.
It's not uncommon, actually. you can argue if people get carried away with the argument. I know and respect the arguments against belief. I just don't share them. But I admit quite clearly that I reject unbelief because of a choice, and the nature of my choice is that I prefer that sort of universe. Of course, the atheists get cross because the implication of that, which I clearly state, is that they prefer another sort of universe. And the most interesting part of this whole argument is the speculation on why atheists prefer that sort of universe, which only Professor Thomas Nagel, one of the more intelligent and articulate atheists, has ever bothered to examine as a summary. Why, he asks, am I so anxious for there not to be a God? It's a good question.
It is. What's the answer in your view?
In my view, the answer is that of course, most of us have got things of which we're profoundly ashamed, and things which trouble our conscience, the things of which our conscience is afraid. The remembrance of them is grievous unto us, and the burden of them is intolerable, as it says in the confession at the Lord's Supper. And those things are, in a chaotic, accidental universe, they're consigned to the past. And they are, if not forgotten, they lack any importance outside the moment at which they were done. So there is that. On the other hand, I tend to think that people are still troubled by them. I mean, the things that I did 30, 40 years ago which still trouble me, and that the consolation which religion gives is that you can admit to these things and regret them and seek forgiveness for them, but only a divine forgiveness. So you're given a hope, whereas the atheist has no hope. If he can't forgive himself, then there's no one else available to forgive him. And so there's a tendency, if there's something you can't forgive yourself for, to try and reorder the legislation of the universe, to make the thing that you've done universal, and to make it good. And I think probably abortion is the biggest single issue in which people do that. A lot of people have had a part in procuring an abortion, especially of the 60s generation. Either they underwent it, or they put pressure on somebody to have one, and they don't like it. But the way they cope with it is by trying very, very diligently to persuade themselves and others that abortion, in fact, is not a misdeed. I think that is the point at which the 60th generation dipped their hands in the blood of the revolution more than anything else, and I think it's hugely important subject as a result.
To what extent then do your religious beliefs influence your take on current affairs, for same-sex marriage?
And on same-sex marriage, I've said it before, I say it again, it's such a trivial issue, I really can't be bothered with it, and I think that it's simply a trap. The issue of sexual morality is quite simple from the Christian point of view. All sexual acts outside lifelong monogamous heterosexual marriage are wrong, all of them. And there's a huge number of things, and very, very few of those things are homosexual. Most of them heterosexual. It's the heterosexual breach of the marriage laws, effectively, which are very powerfully part of the Christian religion. That is the major issue of sexual morality. The homosexual business is such a side issue and affects so few people. And it's simply, engaging in it is simply a way of getting yourself falsely portrayed as a bigot who hates homosexuals.
So you're fairly apathetic towards that? Well,
I just refuse to engage in it. And I say to Christian friends of mine who get involved in campaigns against it, you're wasting your time. You're just making fools of yourself. You'll be beaten, it doesn't really matter, and at the end of it you'll have gained nothing. I can't get most of them to listen to me.
So what do you feel and campaign strongly about? Is there?
Well, I don't campaign. I mean, I am now an obituarist. I don't regard it. I've tried to engage. I still do from time to time because I don't know for certain that my cause is lost. So I have to act as if it might not be. So this last weekend I urged people to vote UKIP, not because I like UKIP. UKIP is still the chaotic, ludicrous dad's army with some quite disagreeable aspects. But the attempt by the Conservative Party to pretend that it's taking serious steps to curb immigration is so disreputable that they need to be punished. And if I can encourage my readers to vote UKIP to punish the Conservative Party, then I'll do so. But it's partly a desire for justice, partly a feeling, well, just possibly, maybe we can shift this rock after all. But I have these flashes of optimism, but generally I find optimism lets you down, so I doubt it. But for the most part, I regard myself as recording the collapse of a great civilization, the willful, voluntary, suicidal collapse of a great civilization. I think one day somebody might be interested to work out how it was that one of the happiest, freest, most orderly societies in human history did away with itself.
You've said proper conservatism in this country is doomed.
Well, I think it's not merely doomed. I think it is actually a corpse in the cemetery. I don't think there is any trace of it left.
Is there anything that politics can do, a political decision or a law passed that you feel so strongly opposed to that you'd leave the country in protest?
No, I can't. I'm not in country leaving mode. I'm 61. It's too late for me to make a new life elsewhere. I'm too tied to this place by too many things.
61's the new 40, isn't it?
Well, yes, but that is as maybe. But it doesn't. That's not the way that, say, if I turned up in Toronto tomorrow and started looking for work, it's not the way I'd find it. They'd look at me as a charge on the state. So I don't think that I don't think that's realistic. So standing around saying, if this happens, I'll leave the country. It's just silly, isn't it? It's the sort of thing that comedians do.
You're completely opposed to the legalisation of drugs. Am I right in saying that?
Well, I'm opposed to it. It doesn't do much good because they have actually been legalised.
What penalty do you think is suitable, for example, somebody who...
Well, why do you ask me these questions? Here I am sitting here. This is a country which de facto legalised cannabis, which is the most important of the illegal drugs, in 1973, when you weren't even a twinkle in anybody's eye. And you're asking me to set out penalties for the punishment of a crime which was abolished coming out for half a century ago. And the whole point about law is that once it's been abolished, it can't generally be resurrected. It's gone. It's a dead issue. What my recent book pointed out, I couldn't get anybody to read it because people don't want to read anything that doesn't fit in with their preconceptions, was that this is what's happened, that we have had a de facto legalization of drugs, and that all the consequences which people point to and say, oh, well, this is the result of our brutal prohibitionary laws, are not the consequences of any such thing. There are no brutal prohibitionary laws. They're the consequences of a widespread, deliberate decriminalization disguised by rhetoric.
But I've heard you and seen you talk about it before, and I'm interested, in a society that you could govern, for example, drugs wouldn't be legal.
Well, no, they wouldn't be, but no such society exists or is likely to. I mean, if you really want to discuss the penal code in Hitchens' grad, we could do so, but what's the point? Yes. You might as well ask me to design an airplane. I mean, it's just futile.
So what's the point in question time? What's the point in discussions?
Well, I don't know. Again, I think I've put all this as part of my activity as obituarist. I want this country to have an accurate obituary when it dies. Won't be long now. But it needs to be accurate. People need to know how and why it died. So my job is to make sure that the official lies are not the only version.
In terms of the European Union then,
yes.
Because you just said that you're encouraging people to vote UKIP even though you don't particularly want to associate yourself with the party. Where are you on the EU?
Oh, if it were up to me, I would secede, yes. There isn't any other. There are only two honest positions to take on the European Union. You're either in it or you're not in it. I think we should be out of it.
And the Conservative Party are offering a referendum on that. Do you think they're
not offering a referendum on it. They're offering a promise of a referendum which they hope very much not to have to be compelled to fulfil. But I don't believe in referendums anyway. I think
direct democracy.
Well, they're incredibly easily manipulated, and this country has a parliamentary constitution. If you want to change the direction of the country, then what you need is a political party which has a policy which it's prepared to put in its manifesto before the country has a general election. If elected, it then goes ahead and does it, using its parliamentary majority to do so. The referendums have always been a device in this country, repeatedly promised, to the English people particularly, and hardly ever given. But they've always been a device for trying to paper over grave disunity in major political parties. And the original common market referendum that Harold Wilson held was designed to avoid a split in the Labour Party. That was its only purpose. But at present, and what would happen if there were a referendum on the European Union membership of this country? There is no serious newspaper which currently takes a secessionist view. The BBC is profoundly opposed to secession and wants us to stay in. So what would be the chance of us voting to leave? And if we did, would it be binding on Parliament?
And you think it wouldn't?
No, I think that even if there were a vote to leave, the government in office would simply use it to go to the European Commission and say, will you please give us some concessions, which they actually wouldn't do, but they would get together with the European Commission to pretend to make some concessions and say, well, thank you very much for those concessions, we'll stay in.
There'd be a national outrage, wouldn't there? If a government completely ignored the result of the referendum. Do you not think there would?
No. What form would it take?
Protests. People wouldn't.
Okay,
people wouldn't
like the countryside march. Okay, well, that'll make all the difference. Or the anti-Iraq war march. Most people simply don't care enough or know enough about the issue in any case.
No, that's very true. And what will support for UKIP therefore change or do about it?
Support for UKIP, the only reason I urge support for UKIP is that it might destroy the Conservative Party. If the Conservative Party is destroyed, there is some possibility, and it's no more than that a genuinely conservative political force could be created. As long as it sits there athwart the way, it's impossible. As long as millions of people believe that the Conservative Party is their friend at Westminster when in fact it's their bitter enemy, then there is absolutely no hope of serious political change in this country.
And the Conservative Party, it has to fold. It has to.
Oh yes, there is. Yeah. David Cameron is absolutely right in one thing. His understanding that the Conservative Party is unelectable. What he thinks, though I think he's probably beginning to realise it's not true, what he thinks is that something can be done about that. The Conservative Party can be made electable and have a national majority again. I think what he probably might be tempted to think, and Michael Portillo has come close to saying this in public, and I often wonder what the view of the Conservative elite is on this, is that the only hope for the Conservative Party is Scottish independence. If with an independent Scotland, there might be a possible Conservative majority at Westminster again, but as long as there's the United Kingdom in its current form, it's not possible.
The Conservative Party in its current form, though, wouldn't campaign for an independent Scotland.
Not openly, no, but I have to say the recent suggestion that the Faslane nuclear submarine base could be declared a sovereign UK territory was a pretty good boost to Alex Salmond. You do wonder sometimes whether the campaign that the government runs against Scottish independence is actually being run by Alex Salmond. It's an explanation. I mean, well, stupidity is often the explanation for things, but sometimes there's another one. I don't think that, I mean, there are ways and ways and ways of campaigning for or against something. And I don't see any sign of a vigorous, articulate or committed campaign to maintain the Union of England and Scotland among the leadership of the Conservative Party. And I have to say that I must suspect that some of them might believe that the departure of Scotland is their only hope of being majority government again. Makes sense, doesn't it?
If, then, we did have a new alternative right-wing political party...
Who says it would be right-wing?
So do you see the Conservatives on a political spectrum in their current form?
No, I don't believe in that political spectrum. I think any thinking person long ago rejected it as meaningless.
Right. So what would be the alternative to the Conservatives in their current form?
Well, the alternative that I would hope to create would be heavily social democratic in social policy. That is, it would maintain a substantial welfare state, and it would be in favour of people having fairly strong employment rights, and it would be concerned about things like social housing. I would try and re-establish some form of council housing, for instance, which is a grievous loss. But it would also be very concerned to maintain the national borders and to prevent any further mass immigration. It would be extremely hard on crime and on disorder. And it would be very rigorous about education.
Would we look to international social policy? Would we look to transfer sort of policies? And
no, why would we? We have our own perfectly good traditions of that. I mean, the Labour Party before about 1965 was a socially conservative party, which was also concerned about the welfare of the people. And then it stopped being concerned with the welfare of the people, and it also became politically radical. It's been hugely transformed. And one of the reasons why the Conservative Party... People sometimes say to me, well, when was the Conservative Party ever conservative? Which the answer is never. But it didn't matter when its opponent was conservative. But when the Labour Party changed into a party of the dogmatic, cultural, moral and social left, and the Conservative Party had no answer to that, then all that Conservative governments are interludes between Labour governments, because if you don't understand your opponent or attempt to reverse the things he does, then you're his ally. And that's what the Conservative Party became. One of the problems about British Conservative politics is that people neither read nor think nor have any interest whatsoever in their opponents. My great advantage in all this is that I'm a former Marxist-Leninist. I understand what the left is, how it thinks, what it really wants, and that makes me not unique but rare among conservatives.
You were a part of the left?
Yeah, certainly was, yeah. And I couldn't do what I do or say what I say unless I had that experience. And
you would never go back?
I can't think of any reason why. In many ways, I haven't left it. I mean, if you listen to what I've just said, you'll have noticed that on a lot of things I take policy positions which are generally associated with the left. Always have done. I was never a Thatcherite, for instance.
No.
And I thought she was right on the Cold War, and I thought she was right on the trade unions, because at the time I was a Labour correspondent, and I knew the trade unions had been penetrated by ultra-leftist political organisations who were being used for that purpose. Not because I was unsympathetic to trade unionism as such. I still carry a union card.
On a different note, when your late brother Christopher was alive, you disagreed with him publicly on a great number of issues.
Yeah, go on.
Don't you ever think, though, that upholding the truth should take second place to personal relationships?
I don't think it should affect personal relationships. I think you can have an argument with somebody about politics without personal relationships being affected.
A public argument?
It was never me that took any of it personally.
No.
My late brother just loved having rows. He even managed to have one with James Fenton, one of the loveliest human beings on the planet, and one of his greatest friends. He managed to have a row with James. I think he was sent to the outer darkness for a while. He just loved having rows.
Did you love having rows?
Not of that kind. I mean, when I wrote what I wrote about what he'd said about September the 11th, I expected him to come back with a counter-argument. What I got was about 3 years of dead silence and a long, angry sulk. Wasn't of my making. I wouldn't. If I'd known that I was going to get that, I wouldn't have done it. But I actually thought it would be fun to have the argument. I enjoy arguing. So does he. But on that occasion, he decided not to argue.
That's the point. Some of the debates you have had publicly have been really entertaining, have looked really fantastic from both of your points of view, because it looks like you thoroughly enjoy it. Did you enjoy then debating with your brother?
It depends which occasion you're thinking of.
So it was entirely dependent on the situation and the subject matter.
Well, it depended. I mean, for the appalling Grand Rapids debate on Iraq and God was one of the most unpleasant experiences of my life. Not because of him precisely. I hadn't realized until I turned up in Grand Rapids and walked into this hall, and for the first time was faced with 1,000 people who hated me. That they didn't hate me because of who I was. They hated me because, as far as they were concerned, Christopher was a megastar and the main feature, and they had to sit through me, much as in the old days you used to have to sit through a B movie in the cinema before you got to the real film. And the other thing was that the sound system didn't work terribly well up where we were on the platform, so I couldn't actually hear what he was saying. If you watch the ghastly YouTube of the debate, you'll see at one point that I moved forward and actually sit on the edge of the stage. I think at one point I even sat in the audience because I couldn't hear what he was saying. Now, when you're arguing with Christopher about God, he doesn't care what you're saying. He's going to say the same thing whatever you say. But I was quite interested in what he was saying, and I wanted to reply to it, but I couldn't. So it put me at a big disadvantage because I actually couldn't hear a lot of what he was saying. So that wasn't fun at all.
Is that a difference, you would say?
It was a miserable occasion, and which I still look back on with horror. But the debate we did at the Conway Hall, which is less well known, and was a much more enjoyable, satisfactory experience.
Would you say you do listen to what people say more than Christopher did?
That's an invidious question. I like to think that I listen to what people say when I'm arguing with them, yeah.
Finally, Peter, we're interviewing UKIP's Nigel Farage and Green Party leader Natalie Bennett. And if you give us a question to ask each of them, we will.
I have no questions to ask the Green Party.
No questions.
I mean, I can't think of anything to say. I mean, I can't. It's the gulf is so great that one wouldn't know where to start. I think you'd better ask Nigel Farage when he stopped calling himself Farage. One of his teachers at Dulwich College recently came out and said you should have come across this in your research, that when he was at Dulwich College he called himself Farage.
Yeah.
The other thing you could ask him about is what his actual attitude is towards marijuana, cannabis. He did muse a few years ago on Any Questions on Radio 4 about decriminalisation. And I wonder whether that is in fact his view.
And no questions for the Green Party?
Well, I don't. I mean, nothing is going to alter my opinion on the Green Party. I'm
very quickly, what is that opinion?
Well, they are. They're a dogmatic successor to really to old-fashioned state socialism. And that their dogma is based, it seems to me, on a lot of very questionable assumptions.
Environmental policy is obviously their main concern.
Well, yes, but I mean, we're all in favour. I joined Friends of the Earth in the 1970s. I've always hated the rape of the countryside and the pollution of the seas and rivers and the sky. Who doesn't? I've been riding a bicycle on principle since Boris Johnson was at prep school. It doesn't get me any kudos because I'm a bad person, so it doesn't count. But I don't. What I really object to about the Greens is their arrogation to themselves of the idea that they are the only people who care about the planet, and that theirs is the only way of caring about it. And those who happen to disagree with their dogma are necessarily, therefore, bad people, which is where we came in.
It doesn't require a single political party for those issues.
Well, I mean, I'm happy for it to be represented. I don't. That's up to them and the people who vote for them. I just don't like them, and I particularly dislike this arrogation to themselves of the sole right to speak for the planet against those who would despoil it. I tend to think of myself as being against the despoiling of the planet. I just don't happen to think that their methods of preventing it are right or properly based.
We will leave it there. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate you coming back in. Thank you,
Pleasure.
Peter.